All right, good afternoon. As you're settling in, just a quick remark before we start. So part of this lecture will have interactive clicker responses from your side. I don't know if any of you have ever used clickers. Be that as it may, my colleagues here are going to be distributing clickers as per the sections. So if any of you would like to have a clicker and interact with some of the questions that are going to be asked, please feel free. We have a limited number per section, but I see it's not a full house. But please make sure if you're going to take a clicker, present your AUB ID, keep it with them, and at the end, we'll exchange, because unfortunately in the past, some students have walked away with a few clickers. Okay? So if you'd like a clicker to interact with some of the questions we're going to be raising, which is fun, please make sure you provide your ID. What's with the what? Clicker interactive response. At some points, I'll be asking questions and you can answer A, B, C, D. Yeah, it's fun. So again, as some of our colleagues are just walking in now, let me reiterate. We're going to have interactive clickers distributed. If you're going to take one, please make sure you provide your AUB ID and make sure you pick it up at the end of the session, obviously. All right. What are we doing on time? We need about 40-something minutes. So. Okay, so if we could settle in, please, so we can get started. It's almost 1:05 now, right? No idea. So, so today's presentation is on, well, under the broad heading of the scholastic tradition or scholasticism, with a particular, of course, emphasis for illustration on the author you'll be reading, Thomas Aquinas. Okay, so let me start with, before we launch into the content of the presentation itself, let me just start with briefly, whoops, what did I press that I shouldn't have pressed? Okay. Which one is the pointer, do you know? Yeah, I just want the pointer now.
You want the pointer? Sorry, the pointer is as well.
Okay, perfect.
But it's the other one.
Perfect, thank you.
It's the third one. Yeah.
This one, thank you. Okay. So in a manner of introducing today's lecture on scholasticism, when you're ready, if you're ready. So. Okay, so as I said, today's lecture is on scholasticism in the broadest sense, or the scholastic tradition, and we're going to be focusing on Thomas Aquinas as an illustration. Okay. So as a manner of introducing today's lecture, I'm referencing here a painting which is definitely not from the scholastic era. It's a 19th century painting, but which I think does very well to capture much of what we're going to talk about here today. So this is by Ludwig Seitz in the 19th century. And it's a lovely painting of, basically, as the title says, faith and reason. And the idea here is that that's faith on that side, Sorry, that's reason on that side, that's faith on this side, and they're having a lovely, cordial conversation, faith and reason united. Right? Very, very lovely. More centrally, perhaps, is the inscription, which he has at the top there, which is from Pope Leo XIII's encyclical of the time, and that inscription in Latin, in English, would read, "The splendor of divine truths received into the mind helps the understanding," right? And again, this notion of faith and reason united is there. And a final little detail of the painting I'd also like you to pay attention to is a man leaning back on this side. Also on this side, I can tell you it's the same person. And in both cases, so whether behind reason or whether behind faith, he is surrounded by students, and he's teaching them and he's lecturing them. And that man is none other than Thomas Aquinas, your author for this week. So essentially what we have here is a painting from the 19th century which captures, in some sense, the key elements of what you encounter when we speak about scholastic tradition or Thomas Aquinas or etc., as you'll see in our, through the context of our presentation today, I hope. Sorry. So, the other reference sometimes we speak of when talking about scholasticism is the medieval synthesis, right? So medieval is, of course, not evil. It's medieval, as in Middle Ages, okay? And when we speak about the synthesis here, again, keep in mind Ludwig Zeit's painting, the synthesis of reason and faith, or in broader terms, it was philosophy and religion, specifically, as you will see, Aristotelian philosophy, most specifically, and the religious tradition rooted back from Augustine and the fathers, so to speak. Okay, so hopefully that will come across in today's lecture, which aims precisely at introducing you to some of the key elements of the scholastic tradition and this kind of medieval synthesis that we're already talking about. And of course, we'll focus on particular illustrations from the work from Thomas Aquinas that you will be dealing with. Before I start, I have to say that normally, particularly in these scholarly circles, we say scholastic tradition, we're referencing the school, or scholasticus, right? And so the name itself has an etymology and a history which goes back to the schools. Nowadays, you'd call them universities, okay? To the schools of Europe and the schoolmen of Europe, i.e. the people, the professors, the headmasters who were teaching in those schools, Europe. Still around, for instance, are Oxford, Cambridge, the Sorbonne, all these great universities have been around for so long, where you had the scholastic tradition actually begin, because it was started by the schoolmen of that time, right? So that's as far as the name is concerned. As far as the evaluation is concerned, I can tell you, I don't know if any of you are familiar, when we use the term scholastic, we very rarely mean anything positive. Scholastic and scholasticism is usually taken to be negative, is usually taken to be, uninteresting, kind of what we call also the Dark Ages, which I assure you were not dark at all. There was much of interest going on, as I hope we'll see today. But certainly there's a general kind of attitude of negative appropriation or association with scholasticism. Don't take my word for it. I'll give you two basic examples. This is from the 15th century Italian humanist, Laurentius Valla, who says, speaking about the scholastic thinkers or philosophers, he calls them that superstitious and senseless race of professors who make their pupils swear never to contradict Aristotle. Right? So this is his summation already in the 15th century, which was, of course, was reacting to the centuries before it. The age of Renaissance was reacting. Not a very flattering picture, right? Superstitious and senseless professors. Do you know any such professors? A more recent, of course, historically speaking, 19th century, just to show you how this kind of general evaluation goes, is from Hippolyte Taine in 19th century, where he says 3 centuries, he summarizes the scholastic era, right? 3 centuries. 3 centuries at the bottom of that gloomy abyss did not add a single idea to man's intellectual inheritance. Right? Very, very flattering evaluation. Which, of course, with just these two on that slide there and many others we could conjure up, we'd say, well, what are we doing talking about them then? What's the point of discussing scholastic tradition and medieval synthesis and Thomas Aquinas, if apparently they added, of course, this is a bit unfair to say the least. And I hope through today's lecture, and of course more centrally through your reading and discussion of the selections you have from Thomas Aquinas, we hope to show the centrality of much of the discussion that was going on in the works of the scholastic philosophers. That does not mean we want to go back to being scholastics, of course not. And the same thing when we talked about Ibn Rushd and Maimonides, we're not saying we want to go back. But I hope we can attain a certain level of authentic appreciation of their work and to see what they were doing, why they were doing what they were doing, and so on. And at least that's the purposes of today's presentation. Before we do so, however, I ask you to indulge me with the following exercise, and hence the clickers you have. Right? So I want to present you with a little hypothetical case scenario. Right? And the hypothetical case scenario goes as follows. Imagine, if you will, that today, young women and men that you are, and students, scholars, suppose that you were a person of monotheistic faith, of some authority, so maybe not just a student, and one with broad scholarly interests. And imagine that you were informed of the recent discovery of a corpus of works, a body of works, a large collection of works, in a language of times past, and that the suspicion is that this corpus may hold much of the wisdom of the past. Right? Great discovery. So what would you do? A, procure corpus and make sure that no word of such discovery gets out until you can figure out what to do with it. B, make sure that no word of such a discovery ever gets out and destroy the works, destroy the corpus. C, do you bring together a group of scholars to study and translate the corpus? Or D, do you procure it and sell it to the highest bidder? Easy D. Let's see. So I'll wait for your responses as they come in there. How many did we distribute? So I know when. The 20-something already. Okay. 22 responses. I think we have more clickers in the audience than that, right? No? 24, 25? It's not graded. No? All right, I'll stop at 24, I think is fine. The others are shy. All right, let's see what we have here. Brilliant. 13% say, let me think about it. 13% say, what's there to think about? Sell it, man. And 75% say, bring together a group of scholars to study and translate the corpus. All right. So that's the first case scenario. Now imagine we go with the majority because, democracy and whatnot. And so we say, all right, so let's get a group of scholars, study and translate the works. But imagine that as we do that, and the more we study and translate the works, the more we get into them, the more we realize that the content of the works stands in many ways, in many respects, possibly against the accepted beliefs and traditions, and that it may be indeed, on some level, threaten the widely accepted worldview that we have. Right? So the more we study it, the more we sense that maybe this will actually shatter or threaten or go against a number of our accepted beliefs and traditions. Now what do we do? Do we make a public announcement of the discovery and its contents, urging all people to re-examine their accepted worldviews? Do we burn all the manuscripts? Brand anyone who ever mentions them as a criminal and a heretic and whatnot? Do we continue studying further and seek from them what may indeed be of much use and wisdom? Or do we cover up the fact that they've been translated, pretend they just got discovered, and sell to the highest bidder? That's always an option, right? So we had 24 the first round, so we'll stop at 24 for consistency. All right? So we study them, we translate them, we get a sense they're going to stand against some of our beliefs and traditions, perhaps force us to examine some of our beliefs and traditions. So what do we do? What to do? There's 2 more. We'll quit the race. خلاص ما بدنا. Don't keep me waiting. All right, I'm going to just go with 22. I'll see. All right, I'm going to go with 24. 23. No 24? Going once? Done. All right. Whew. Slight change, but except in terms of the aggregate, it actually went up. So the 13 who wanted to sell the first time, I think they still want to sell. They're, they still see there's a great value for money here. Burn all the manuscripts. I will not ask you to raise your hands, those who voted there. Make a public announcement. That's very courageous. That's very, I think, 21st century. Change your belief systems, re-examine them, and then you can handle the chaos that may arise. And continue studying further, 48%. So if we combine A and C, actually we've gone to 78. The first was, the translation was 75. So, but more or less, the same. It's very much, as you might imagine, 21st century of you, right? To translate these works, study them, and yes, even if they start to threaten us, well, let's continue study them. But believe it or not, that was exactly the situation 800 years or so ago in Spain. Because essentially, that's what happened back then. What happened is that for a long time, the Europeans had believed they had lost the corpus of Aristotle. They didn't have access to Aristotle. And so for a long time, they had Plato, they had plenty of Plato, but they had lost contact with the Aristotelian corpus, particularly the Greek Aristotelian corpus. But this is the time, the 11th century, as a time of reconquests, what we call the reconquest, when the Europeans were reconquering some parts of Spain and whatnot. And this is a time of Alfonso the Great reconquering Toledo in Spain. And in that reconquest, they discovered the great library of Toledo, which housed so much of the translations and the studies and the works of the Arab Islamic and the Judaic and the Christian thinkers and philosophers before them. And if you remember, we mentioned something like that with Ibn Rushd last time, the translation movements and what Cordoba was and what Spain was. So they had a great treasure they discovered in Toledo. And the prince, the conqueror, explicitly said, none of these works should be harmed. None of these works should be harmed. And they protected it. And then they decided to study it, as you decided. And even at some points when they felt it might start to threaten their worldview, they continued to study it. But they, of course, as I said at the beginning, the schoolmen, in the universities, in the schools, of course, right? And this is, one may say, the beginnings of what then we later call the scholastic tradition, the rediscovery, not discovery, of course, but the rediscovery of the Aristotelian corpus, translated with the commentaries of Ibn Rushd and the commentaries of, to some extent, Ibn Bajjah and Maimonides and many others. And so not only did they discover or rediscover the Aristotelian and Greek corpus, but they discovered with it this fantastic reference from translators and commentators and different Arabic and Judaic and Judaic and Christian philosophers. And in a manner of speaking, you can almost speak of a snowball effect whenever that happens. So it starts there in Toledo. This is courtesy of Google Maps, of course. And somehow this whole movement on interest travels all the way around up to southern France, particularly in Marseille. Today's Marseille. And also in Toulouse, there was also quite some interest. There was a circle of scholars who would study and translate and commentary, and all the way down to Sicily, and particularly in Palermo, where it's thought finally the complete works of the metaphysics of Aristotle was finally translated into Latin. So there was a really a great snowball effect. Of course, it always helps when you have rulers. For instance, in Palermo, we're told the ruler was very, very supportive of this kind of study and scholarly activity and translation movement and whatnot. And so, in a manner of speaking, what we start to call it as the Toledo event in the history of ideas and the history of thought, right? Because this Toledo event, which is the rediscovery of this corpus, launched this kind of immense interest and discovery and rediscovery and translation and study of these great works that stemmed all around the European, if you wish, continent. Also all the way up, as you'll see later, to Ireland, and of course Scotland and England. So as I said, in Sicily we are told that finally the works of Aristotle's metaphysics were finally fully translated by William of Moerbeke, who's also reported to be a friend or at least an acquaintance of Thomas Aquinas, who you're going to be reading today. Which raises the following question, I think, for us, right, to understand fully the Toledo event. So if you were to take a wild guess, who of the following would you think was the main drive and engine behind the translation movement that started in Toledo? Who pushed it, right? Was it the common people of Toledo, the political powers? Was it the Archbishop of Toledo, or was it the scholars and schoolmen of Toledo? Who fully pushed it? Who fully sponsored it and supported it and caused it to grow that kind of dynamic snowball effect? Was it the common people, the political powers, the Archbishop, or the scholars and schoolmen of Toledo? It's a wild guess, yeah? Or maybe not. Maybe an educated guess. Responses. Good. All right, so let's see where your wild guesses went. I'm so sorry. That's totally my fault, because I speak about the schoolmen and the schoolmasters, and you assume, yes, I'm sorry, that's a trick question. Actually, it's not the scholars and schoolmen of Toledo. 0% voted for the common people of Toledo. Of course, you were right. The common people, Yamattarin at the time. The political powers, yes, maybe. But actually, it was the Archbishop of Toledo. He was the one who fully embraced this and fully said, this is what we need to do. We need to translate these works, study them in the schools, in the universities, i.e. And I kind of gave you a hint earlier. In that earlier picture, I said, Toledo's cathedral housed the translators in the 12th century. Blatant hint. Why do I want to focus on that rather small detail? I think it's absolutely important to stop at that detail, to say the following. Generally, in a rather cliched manner nowadays, we pit philosophy and religion against each other. We say, the men or women of reason and philosophy versus the men and women of religion. And especially when we speak about the past, there's always philosophy versus religion. And I think it's very, very important to note that that is actually a false cliche in most. Yes, is it possible that that's happened? Of course, right? But it's actually a false cliche that we have, that the struggle has been between the rationalists and the religious and the faith. And as we started today's lecture with Ludwig Zeitz, faith and reason united, right? And it was the Archbishop of Toledo who, upon the discovery of these works in the library in Toledo, collected a group of scholars, a group of translators, and said, this is what we need to do. Study it, translate it. Let us know what you find. And the more they found, they said, oh, right, the more we need to study this. Even though, and it is true, at certain points, some of the corpus, which was also true in the case of the Arab Islamic philosophers like Ibn Rushd or Ibn al-Kindi before him, yes, some of the work, some of the arguments, some of the discussions in Aristotle do threaten or do stand against the common accepted traditions or the common accepted beliefs in a broadly monotheistic context, right? But for someone like the Archbishop here, Raymond was his name, or his students or his scholars, that was more reason to re-examine our understanding of both revelation, but also to re-examine the proper method and the proper mode of reasoning, right? And hence this push towards the synthesis, as we said, the medieval synthesis, as we called it. Now, of course, to suggest that it all begins in Toledo is kind of out of a vacuum, or would, of course, like any historical event, be false, because no historical event just pops out of nowhere. And so very briefly, I want to just go back slightly a few centuries before the Toledo event and tell you this was always an interest, studying the Greek philosophers, translating them, understanding them, discussing and debating the possible coexistence or not between conclusions of philosophy and revelation and whatnot. And you can go all the way back to Boethius in the 6th century, who was a very established statesman and scholar, and who started to fear, actually, and that's what drove him. He felt that Greek was becoming less and less of the lingua franca, of the language, and Latin was starting to take root, and he was worried that the Greek texts would be lost, right, if the Greek language is lost. And so he begins to translate, mostly he was concerned with Plato's works, but also, whatever he had there. And he also wrote a very, his most famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy, which is basically a dialogue with philosophy. Right? Philosophy presented as a character, as a person in the constellation, and debating on various questions with philosophy herself. A very central character, of course, is John Scotus Erigena, which basically means John from Ireland. That's what his name means. And Ireland had an interesting standing in this tradition before the Toledo event, because whereas Latin was becoming more and more the language of education in mainland Europe, in Ireland, actually Greek remained the language of education, and so John Scotus had access to the Greek texts, and he immersed himself in the study of the Greek texts. And this is a central quote from his works, which again shows this notion of the synthesis, or faith and reason united, whereby he writes, Christ, he says, wears two shoes in the world, Scripture and nature. Both are necessary to understand the Lord. And at no stage can creation be seen as a separation of things from God, right? So this emphasis on the study of both the natural world, natural philosophy, as well as, of course, Scripture and revelation. Saint Anselm is perhaps one of the most famous, and many believe he's considered the first kind of scholastic philosopher or thinker. He was one of the earliest to propose what we call the ontological proof for God's existence in his work. Definitely working also from the Greek tradition. Abelard is perhaps a tragic figure and one of my favorites, also very central to the tradition. He named his son Astrolabe. Any of you know what an astrolabe is? Huh? It's an instrument they used to use to study the stars, and which I don't know. I stick on these details. He doesn't name him after like a common name or a saint or his father, or he names him after I don't know how his son felt about it, but and so you can speak about a long tradition, of course, that goes all the way to William of Ockham, through Robert Grosseteste, and of course we're going to talk about Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus, etc. My main point here as an introductory remark is that this medieval synthesis that really flourishes and develops after the Toledo event certainly is not the child of the Toledo event, right? This interest is already there. This interest in trying to find as Boethius says, the consolation of philosophy, trying to have this dialogue between reason and revelation. It's always been there. I'm sure you sensed it very clearly with Augustine, for instance, right? Of course, his interest was mostly in Plato there, in the text you're reading. So the tradition is there, but happens simply with the Toledo event is that suddenly with this interest that's already there, you have this immense body of works, of Aristotle particularly, translated, commented on, etc., which fully push forward this tradition, and it becomes really the scholastic tradition. It has very specific modes of writing, of thinking, how it's done, how it's not done, and so it becomes a philosophical tradition in its own right, so to speak. And as I said, this is essentially something that was housed in these universities, in these schools, whether in Toledo, whether in Palermo, whether in Milan, whether certainly in Oxford or later Cambridge, in England. However, of course, a note of importance here, something similar to Ibn Rushd, that's where the debates stayed, right? So these debates don't then become public debates, right? So within the school grounds, so to speak, within the universities, these were very lively debates. How does one make sense of Aristotle in relation to this verse or that verse or this revelation or this teaching from, Augustine or whoever? But these were on-campus debates, so to speak. For the public, of course, as Ibn Rushd had also told us, that's a different language. You don't use a demonstrative language. Good. So before we move on to the next part where we focus on Thomas Aquinas, a quick review question. This is one of those annoying, have you been paying attention kind of questions. So at the beginning of the presentation today, we had Ludwig Geist's painting there, and we said there was a nice man on both sides behind faith and reason in that background. Who was it? Was it Pope Leo XIII? Was it Thomas Aquinas? Was it Augustine of Hippo? Or was it Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Rushd, otherwise known as Averroes? You're thinking, why isn't this one graded, right? This is an easy push-up question. The clicker questions gives me time to take a sip. Saha. Oh, the 24th is back. Welcome back. Fantastic. Thank you. Absolutely. Thomas Aquinas, right? Ibn Rushd, يا ريت لا ما له محل هون. Augustine, no, not here. Yes, definitely. Okay, so we've all been paying, all 24 of us have been paying attention, even the 24th. Good. So, with that, now we move to the author of the week that we're looking at as an exemplary, really, a fantastic illustration of the scholastic tradition in terms of aims as well as in terms of methods. And what I mean by that is in terms of what he intends to do with his works, with the synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and revelation. I'll give you a quick review now of the division of his works and the chapters. You can sense the kind of aims he has in this work, but as well as the method, because there's something we start to then reference as the scholastic method, or this is very scholastic or whatnot, right? And I think Aquinas is a great illustration of the scholastic method, which of course we'll cover here today. So, very briefly, I'm not a big fan of biographies these days. You can find them anywhere online or whatever. But it is just important to say that he is certainly a very central and very interesting character, to speak of him as a person. But also to speak about his studies in Paris, where he encountered the Averroists, was very interested for a while. But then at one point he countered the Averroists. And the Averroists are basically the followers of Ibn Rushd, right, in the school of Paris. But they were really very kind of Averroists, to the point one might say Averroists might have disapproved. They were overly rational, so to speak, and that's at least what Aquinas felt. And it is reported that Haram, at one point, they kind of ambushed him and beat him up, or Haram, fashu khallon. But one of my favorite anecdotes about Aquinas, and this is related by recently departed, Haram, Allah yarhamu, Umberto Eco, Italian philosopher. He wrote quite a bit on the aesthetics of Thomas Aquinas and on Aquinas, and he relates a very lovely anecdote just to help introduce you to the man. Not, he was born and just something about him as an interesting character. So apparently when he was at the Abbey, where he was, studying and, to be ordained as a priest and whatnot, which was an Augustinian Abbey, he says, there's one thing that is known about Aquinas. He loved food. And apparently he would say, may the Lord forgive me this one sin and whatnot. But the other abbots with him, sorry, not the abbots, the monks, had the thing about him. He was very gullible. Do you know what I mean by gullible? Right? He'd believe almost anything, right? So whenever he'd be sitting down at the kitchen table, they'd run in and say, Thomas, there's a donkey flying outside. Come. And he would get up and run outside, and they go, fine, you guys. And he'd go back in. And Umberto Eco relates this story, and he says, this happened quite a few times, right? Thomas, there's a donkey flying outside. It's over and over again. Until one day the abbot just couldn't keep his cool anymore. He went up to Thomas, Shubek Habibi. And of course he said it in Latin, right? What's wrong with you? Every time they do this to you, you go outside, there's no donkey flying. Why do you keep falling for this? And of course, Aquinas in his response schooled everyone. And Umberto Eco quotes the following. Aquinas responds to the abbot saying, well, it seemed to be, to me, more likely that a donkey would fly than a monk would lie. No one, of course, ever. So, there's plenty of anecdotes, and, there's an anecdote, because he comes from a rather kind of what you might consider an aristocratic family, and at the time, aristocratic families, one of their sons goes off to join the monastery. That's not a good thing. That's so there's other anecdotes about how they tried to stop him, and, they got him a prostitute and whatnot, and apparently one version says he converted her, the other version says, he chased her around the room with fire or something. So there's plenty of anecdotes. I think, I encourage you to look up the life of Thomas Aquinas. Really interesting character, very interesting, beyond, when he was born and what he studied. But of course, for our purposes here, as I said, he studied at Paris. He studied and he encountered the Averroists, and one would say he had a conflict with the Averroists, which also shaped part of his discussion, part of his method and scholastic reasoning, right? And you are reading selections from two of his works, the Summa Contra Gentiles, so the first part you're reading there, and the second from the Summa Theologia, which he left unfinished. And this is a very important other anecdote from his life. Following a profound revelatory experience in 1273, in light of which he abandons writing, explaining to his secretary, Brother Reginald, he says, I can write no more, all that I have written seems like straw. right, in comparison to this experience. So he is very much also experiential in his own way, right? But of course, the works that we have, because as you see, he doesn't write after that. So the works that we have are the ones that mostly influence the scholastic tradition and the scholastic movement, and that's the selection he's going to be reading. So as I said, there's two selections you're reading from. The first is from the Summa Contra Gentiles. I just want to give you an idea of the breakdown of the work. It's an immense work of 4 books, as we'd say, 102 chapters the first. And look at the general themes. The first one is of God, of creation, of providence, of salvation. Here's some just examples from within it, just to give you a sense of how the synthesis works in all of his chapters, right? Remember, the synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and the questions of faith and revelation. So you have sample chapter titles. Here, arguments in proof of the existence of God, which is also the theme of the selections you're reading from the Summa Theologia, that God is not a body, i.e. the proof that God is not a body, that God is one, etc., right? And these are all kind of argumentative, logical presentations. These are your reading selections that you're going to be covering from the Summa Theologia, the Summa Contra Gentiles. And what I want to start with is from precisely that first part you're reading in chapter 2, the author's intention, right? Where Thomas Aquinas very clearly tells us what he intends to do with this work. I think it's very important to read what he intends to do. And this is what Aquinas writes. He says, among all human pursuits, the pursuit of wisdom is more perfect, more noble, more useful, and more full of joy. Right? And what do you think he means by the pursuit of wisdom? Philosophia. Plus 200. You can drop the course. It is more perfect because, right? Insofar as man gives himself to the pursuit of wisdom, right? So far does he even now have some share in true beatitude. It is more noble because in this pursuit such and so, it is more useful, etc. It's all, your readings, look at it, okay? So he sets up with this, but of course, to simply say philosophy and stop there is only half the story, right? Because as you'll see with Thomas Aquinas, wisdom is not just rational wisdom. Wisdom is not just philosophical wisdom, right? It is wedded to these other aspects that he is discussing, whether in this work or as you'll see in his other works, would have to do with revelation, right? And he's very clear in the Summa Contra Gentiles that some truths are revealed to us precisely because reason cannot attain them, right? And some truths which are revealed to us, reason can also attain them, right? Then he says, and so in the name of the divine mercy, I have the confidence to embark upon the work of a wise man, even though this may surpass my powers, and I have set myself the task of making known, as far as my limited powers will allow, the truth that the Catholic faith professes, and of setting aside the errors that are opposed to it, right? This is essentially his aim. Yes, using numerous tools of philosophy, using numerous references from Aristotle as well as Ibn Rushd and others. But the aim is to correct errors if there are any. And I ask you to connect this to the closing paragraph or to the closing section in Ibn Rushd's work in the Decisive Treatise, because essentially that's also Ibn Rushd's concern, right? The importance of philosophy, as Ibn Rushd presents it there, is this idea to correct the injuries and the errors that have been committed within the religious context, the monotheistic context. So then the next question he says is on the way in which divine truth is to be made known, right? And I'll read this first 3 lines. He says, the way of making truth known is not always the same, and as a philosopher has very well said, it belongs to an educated man to seek such certitude in each thing as the nature of that thing allows. Who is the philosopher? Right? Because he says, and as the philosopher says, come on, we all know, right? As the philosopher says, go. You were saying? Yes, absolutely. Don't hesitate. Of course, it's Aristotle, right? So you see that though here he's saying what my aim is to do, as much as I can, right? Is set myself the task of making known the truth of the Catholic faith professes and of setting aside the errors that are opposed to it, right? So it's a religious question. What he begins with as a reference is the philosopher, it's Aristotle. These are, when I say synthesis, when we speak about the medieval synthesis, this is what we mean. This kind of comfortable back and forth between rational, philosophical, Aristotelian references arguments, and faith, revelation, right? And you see this constantly in Aquinas, as of course I think was also clear with Ibn Rushd, and before them, sorry, skip that question, we're out of time. Good. So, I won't go much into the content of that first selection you're reading from the Summa Contra Gentiles, but suffice it to say that basically what he has in mind is a very central distinction which you don't see with previous philosophers in the monotheistic traditions, such as, we speak about Ibn Rushd, or maybe before them Ibn Sina, and it's a very central distinction which he draws. Because when he speaks about seeking the divine truth, or truth of the divine, he makes a distinction between truths that have to do with divine essence and those that have to do with divine existence, right? And this is a very central distinction which Aquinas presents. Because what he wants to argue, both in the Summa Contra Gentiles as well as the Summa Theologia, is that reason and Aristotelian reasoning is a brilliant tool to help us address the level of the existence and things related to the existence of the divine. As to the essence of the divine, as to knowing the essence of the divine, that's something that reason cannot access, right? And so that's a very important distinction which he sets and which he presents the argument for very clearly in the selections you have from the Summa Contra Gentiles. Arguments of the sort, why is it that reason cannot attain those truths about divine essence? And how is it that reason can attain the other truths, right? And on the second question, how reason can be used to basically demonstrate the existence of God or to prove the existence of God, that's essentially what the selections you're reading from the Summa Theologia, and which I will use to show you a very good illustration of the scholastic method from Thomas Aquinas. So again, very briefly, it's a huge part, huge work with various parts, different questions addressed in each of the parts, such as the unity of God, the names of God, the power of God, charity, the gift of wisdom, etc. You're going to be reading from the first part on the existence of God, right? So the selections you're reading cover the question of, does God exist? Essentially, if you want to turn it into a question, okay? And for Thomas Aquinas, this brings itself down to three questions, not one. The first question is whether the proposition God exists is self-evident. The second question is whether it is demonstrable. And the third question, well, whether God exists, right? So let me say a few words about each very briefly. What he means by whether the proposition God exists is self-evident is, in the philosophical, again, language, Aristotelian and so on, if something is self-evident, that means it requires no proof, okay? And there has been arguments that God's existence is self-evident. This is somewhat something what Anselm, for instance, suggested, and I mentioned him earlier as a figure in the scholastic tradition. The idea that, for instance, just again to give more palpable, closer examples, if you look around at the colors of these chairs, you have the fact or the experience that you're seeing the color navy blue. That is self-evident. You don't need to prove to yourself that you're seeing the color. Whether the color actually is real or not, whether the chair is really that color or not, that's a different question. Does that make sense? Right? So that's an example of something which is just, it's clear that I'm seeing something. I just don't know whether it corresponds to a reality or not. So if we say that God's existence is self-evident, that means his existence or God's existence needs no proof. All right? Which, as I said, was argued by some. Aquinas will say it is actually not self-evident. Okay? So fine, if it is not self-evident, can it be demonstrated? Can it be proven? Because simply saying it's not self-evident is not enough. Right? Because I can say it's not self-evident, but guess what? It can't be proven. Right? So Aquinas will say, actually, let me show you that it can be proven. Right? Again, purely philosophical reasoning, as you'll see. Then you can answer the question, does God exist? Only once you've addressed the first two questions. And the manner he goes about it is the following, and I ask you to keep, pay attention to how he writes this. What you will see under each of the three articles or questions is first a set of objections, then on the contrary, he replies. The objections are not his, right? And this is a beautiful illustration of the scholastic method that he's developing or that he's working with. What Aquinas begins with is not the thesis he wants to prove, he begins with the antithesis. right? He begins with the other argument. So he begins with 3 objections, or rather 3 arguments, that God's existence is self-evident, right? Then he will respond to each of these. So first you have 3 objections, then you have 3 replies. Okay? So he responds to these, he replies to each of the objections to show that they actually are not a good argument and that God's existence is not self-evident. All right? And this is how he does each and every one of the 3 articles. So first, is God's existence self-evident? And he gives the 3 basic responses. Right? And he says there are those who would say that the knowledge of God is naturally implanted in us. Yohanna Dimashqi is very famous for having said this, for instance, right? John of Damascus. Or that as soon as the name God is understood, it exists mentally. It also follows that it exists actually. This is St. Anselm, for instance, right? The idea that the moment you understand what it means to speak of God, you will necessarily reach the conclusion that God exists actually, right? And so he responds to these, to each of the objections. He has a response. But in brief, you can take the response as follows. Aquinas basically is saying, look, if God's existence is self-evident, why is it that some doubt it? Right? Because one of the definitions, philosophical definitions of a self-evident truth is that you cannot doubt it even if you wanted to. Right? So, of course, I'm simplifying, I'm just giving you snapshots. The next question then is whether it can be demonstrated. Because if God's existence is not self-evident, some would say, well, we're in real trouble then. Because not only is not self-evident, we can't prove it. For various reasons, right? One of the arguments, for instance, that you can't prove God's existence is, as it says there, that the existence here, the question of the existence of God, is an article of faith. And what is of faith cannot be demonstrated, right? So this is, the existence of God is a question of faith, says the objection. And if something is of faith, you cannot demonstrate it. Aquinas responds beautifully, simplistic. He says, actually, the existence of God is a preamble to faith, not a question of faith. The existence of God, right? God first exists, and then we have faith, right? A second, more perhaps nuanced philosophical argument is that essence is the middle term of demonstration, but we cannot know in what God's essence consists, therefore we cannot demonstrate that God exists. In other words, to prove the existence of X, whatever X is, you have to know its essence, right? But even Aquinas himself, in the first selections you have in the Summa Contra Gentiles, says we cannot know God's essence. So if to prove the existence of something, I need to know what it is, and I cannot know what God is, how can I prove God's existence? Right? And Aquinas says, yeah, actually, no, you don't need to know, well, he doesn't say it that way, of course. You don't need to know the essence of God. You need to know the meaning of what we say, what we mean when we say God, right? In the same way that how many of us know the essence of a cat? Not what a cat is, but what is the essence? What is it to be like to be a cat? No, I don't think any of us wants to pretend that, right? So one doesn't need to know the essence of something, rather just one needs to know what I'm talking about when I say cats. And I think being on campus, you know what I mean when I say cats. Yeah? And then so on and so forth. Right? Is time up by any chance? Okay? So essentially, and this is what we're referring to here as the scholastic method, follow him closely, pay attention. Don't, because students sometimes fall into this. These are not his objections, remember? First he sets down the antithesis he's going to respond to, then his replies and his summary. On the contrary, he says, then he replies. In closing, I will do nothing but quote. Having presented, I hope, some of the key elements of the medieval scholastic tradition, or the medieval synthesis, illustrated briefly from aspects of Aquinas and his interplay between faith and reason, I want to close off with this work by Richard Rubinstein, which I think really captures our quest to revisit and to rethink about the scholastic tradition. Rubinstein says, in reliving the Aristotelian revolution, we understand that we are not just the children of Copernicus and Galileo. Phenomenal. It's amazing how little you think of what you hear, but how highly you think of what you speak. We understand that we are not just the children of Copernicus and Galileo, Adam Smith and Thomas Jefferson, but Aristotle's children, the heirs of a medieval tradition that seems more intriguing and inspiring as the shortcomings of modernity become clearer. Of course, he says, most of us would not return to the Middle Ages if we could. That's not what we're calling for. Few people today would embrace the assumptions and conclusions of the medieval scholastics, but the Aristotelians' quest for meaning is also ours, and we have much to learn from their vision of a science infused by ethics and a religion unafraid of reason. In this little known but formative chapter of our history, we may detect hints of a more humane and integrated global future. Thank you for your attention and patience. Yes, if you've taken clickers, make sure you return them and you get your ID back. Thank you, Judith.